Welcome to Hustle and Flow with Heather Hubbard, episode number 9. Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard, and I was a litigator, partner, and practice group leader at an AmLaw 200 firm. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your personal life. So how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you embrace your ambition without selling your soul? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back. I am your host, Heather Hubbard. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are talking about women, the numbers of women in law firms. And we'll talk a little bit about general counsel and professors as well, and some judges. But for the most part, we are talking about law firms. And I thought I would talk about this topic today because I was invited to speak at the Tennessee Lawyers Association for Women, their empowerment conference here in Nashville. And I was speaking on the topic of women in law, pipeline, retention, and promotion. And it's all about data and statistics and where we are, where we've come from, where we're headed. And I thought, you know what? I think my listeners might really appreciate hearing this information as well. So thank you to TLaw for having me out. And this is a bit of an encore presentation with that information. There is a ton of great data and statistics out there, but I'm only pulling from a few different sources. It's really hard to cover everything in just 30 minutes. So I have picked the 3 that I think are most beneficial, and they're very similar to the other research studies out there. So I'm mostly pulling from the 9th annual NAWL National Survey on Retention and Promotion of Women in Law Firms, and NAWL stands for the National Association of Women Lawyers. I am also pulling from the NALP 2016 report on diversity in law firms. And you're probably familiar with NALP. This is what we all looked at when we were in law school, but it's the National Association for Law Placement. And then last, I'm pulling from the American Bar Association Commission on Women, a current glance at women in the law. Now, in my opinion, statistics don't have to be cold and boring because they tell stories. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Brené Brown, but she is a researcher out of the University of Houston, and she gave a TED Talk that became viral, and now she has several New York Times bestselling books. They're great. I highly recommend you read them. But she says, what if stories are just data with a soul? And I love that analogy. And so I kind of flipped that script. And in my mind, when we're hearing these numbers, when we're hearing the statistics, it's not just a number. It is a person. It is an individual with a soul that has a story to tell. And we can't cover all of those stories in 30 minutes, but we can give a collective snapshot of what all of those stories look like combined. So as you're listening to the episode today, I encourage you to think of the information that I'm sharing with you, not just in terms of cold research, but a collective snapshot of the stories of women in the law. All right, let's jump into the data. Okay, so in 2006, NAWL issued a challenge. They said, okay, look, we have been at this for a long time now, and women are not progressing in the legal field the way that they should. They called it the 50-15-15 conundrum. So 50% of women had been the graduating class of law schools for 15 years. And yet, only 15% were equity partners. Now, in 2006, a lot of firms had moved to a 2-tier system at that point. If you're in a 1-tier system, you're automatically counted as an equity partner. There's no difference between income and equity or non-equity and equity. Everyone's equity. So they said, It's been 15 years with a 50% pipeline. And keep in mind, the pipeline had been pretty good for a few decades before that, right? So we were still graduating women at 30 and 40%. But in 1991, we started graduating women at 50%. And yet 15 years later, in 2006, only 15% of women were not just in those equity positions in law firms, but the number was pretty low for general counsel and for tenured professors at law schools. And so Nall said, we can do better than this. And so we're going to issue this challenge to all of the law firms, to all of the law schools, and all of the corporations to say, hey guys, let's get this number to 30%. In 10 years, we should be able to get 30% of women in those equity roles, 30% of women in those general counsel roles, and 30% of women in the tenured professor roles, because we have the pipeline. We have a great pipeline. So let's make this happen. And so they issued the challenge. A ton of firms and companies and law schools said, yes, we're in. And so what they would do is they would send out a survey every single year to collect data. And they have been analyzing that. So we're now at the point where we're 10 years later and we can look and see what happened. So interestingly enough, after the Nall Challenge, we did start to see the needle move in certain areas. So for example, by 2012, 97% of reporting firms said that they had a women's initiative with a budget. So you would think if most every single firm has some type of women's initiative or committee and they're giving money to women. So I talked about this before in episode number 4, Don't Blame It on the Kids. A lot of the money that's being spent from these women's groups, organizations, it's really for events where women come and hear other women talk. But money is being spent, not in the way I think it should be. But you would think that if firms have gotten behind this, right? Like if there's a committee, if there's an initiative, we should have made a lot of progress. They're committed to the promotion and retention of women. Unfortunately, we've not made much of a difference. 10 years later, we only have 18% equity partners. So in a decade, we only moved the needle 3%. The goal was to double, to go from 15% to 30%. We went from 15% to 18%. I will tell you that the number is better for one-tier systems. For one-tier systems, it's 20%. And for two-tier systems, it's 16%. So the average is 18. But if you are in a two-tier system law firm, you're only at 16%. So basically, we're not making any progress at all on that front. All right, but let's look at the other numbers. Let's get the entire picture of what's going on. So in 2006, the average was that we had 16% female equity partners, 26% non-equity, 28% of counsel, 45% associates. And even that number is a little shocking, right? Like if we are graduating women at 50% from law school classes, why is there only 45% in law firms? I digress. All right, so now let's look 10 years later, how have those numbers changed? Well, I already told you equity went from 16 to 18%. Non-equity, very similar, it went from 26% to 28%. I'm going to move to associates next. That went down. In a decade, we have moved backwards. Granted, it only went down by 1%, but the others have only gone up 2%. So in my opinion, we're really exactly where we were. So associates, they went from 45% women to 44% women. Now, the two categories that are really interesting to me are of counsel and staff attorney. So of counsel went from 28% to 34%. We had a 6% jump in of counsel. And then staff attorney, we didn't really have that role in 2006. So no firms were reporting information on that. It was at 0. But in 2015, so almost 10 years later, firms reported 54% of women in staff attorney roles. Now, when I look at those numbers of counsel and staff attorney, again, this goes back to what I was talking about in episode number 4. I'm a little bit concerned that law firms have created these roles to put women in that are actually allowing us to go backwards. It's one thing if a woman chooses to step into that role because she enjoys it more, but they are non-partnership track roles. And if they want partnership track, that is not helpful. That is not beneficial. And there is some concern that it is basically institutionalizing gender bias. I also want to point out that when NAWL started this, when they issued that challenge in 2006, they had great participation. And each and every year, the participation went down a little bit. It did pretty good, actually, through 2014. It dropped off a bit in 2014, and then it almost plummeted in 2015. And obviously, this is not scientific, but I'm going to go ahead and speculate. Why were firms not submitting the data 10 years later? Is it because they were worried about what the results would show? Right? Why do you participate for 8 years, 9 years, and then you don't in that 10th year, the year that's most important because it's actually measuring that challenge? If all of the firms reported, I wonder if it would not pull that number down and show that we've not actually made progress at all. I'm sure you've seen the report that came out, I believe it was at the end of last year, that says exactly what I'm speculating, that indeed the number of women in equity partner roles and other roles in large law firms has gone backwards. We've actually gone backwards. So it's very, very concerning and should be raising red flags for us. So we all know that women are paid less overall, but let's look at how women are paid in law firms compared to men. We have the data, so let's talk about it. So if you are of counsel, you make 93 cents for every dollar. Now, that's not terrible, right? It's better than the average American statistic, but really it should be 100%. Attorneys, especially in an of counsel role, should be making the same amount of money. So 93% is what women make. For non-equity partners, 96%. So 96 cents on the dollar. I think that's pretty impressive. Again, I'd love to see it equal, but 96%, that's really, really good. And I wonder if that's because a lot of non-equity tiers are in fact salaried, as opposed to having percentages of credit and of the share. So we don't even look at associates because, quite frankly, that is on par. Most law firms have lockstep for associates. So it is, for the most part, I think 100%. But let's go up to equity partners. This one's a little bit more depressing. Equity partners only make 80% of what men make. So 80 cents on the dollar. And you could be thinking, well, in the equity part, you've got a lot of rainmakers, and if the men are bringing in more business, of course, those numbers are going to be skewed. But I find it interesting to note that there is a critical role with the makeup of a compensation committee. So the reporting for compensation committees that had only 1 or 2 women, the number was worse. It was 77% of what men make. Equity partners were making 77%. But for compensation committees that had 3 or more women, the women made 87% of what men made. So to the extent that we don't think that unconscious bias is happening when women are not at the table, we are wrong. I think this data proves the point that when women are at the table, when women can bring a voice, when women are involved, they get treated better. They get treated more equally. And so I just think that gives us a really good reference point to make sure that we are getting as many women on our compensation committees and management committees as possible, because it does make a difference. Okay, so at the current pace of law firm progress, when are we going to hit the 30%, right? We've got this NAWL challenge to get 30% of equity partners to be represented by women. At the current pace of progress, when are we going to get there? 2181. Yeah, I didn't misspeak. I'm going to say it again. The year 2181, not in our lifetime. That is completely unacceptable. And I hope that that fires you up. We cannot stand by and allow this to happen. I fear that we are becoming more and more complacent with pushing gender issues because, one, it's just we are all so tired. We are all exhausted. And I'm sure men feel the same way. We're tired of talking about this. But guess what? If we don't make it a priority, if we don't talk about these things, we're certainly not going to move the needle. And I personally don't believe that this is something that cannot be changed or fixed. This is institutionalized unconscious bias. And unless and until firms are willing to invest and commit and say, this is wrong and we're going to fix it and we're going to get more women involved and we're not going to slow down until it's fixed, we're going to keep these numbers. And so it's on us to be out there and to continue pushing these issues and to recruit men to join us in the fight. Okay, one more, even more depressing information before I move to some good news. Hopefully you had a chance to read in the American Bar Association Journal. I think it came out in early of 2016. It was called Invisible Then Gone. And it is an article about women of color in large law firms. So we're talking today about women, and I think it's easy for us to group all women together, and that's unfair because women of color have it far more worse than those of us that are white women. Of the reporting, it's actually hard to get good data on women of color. So there's a lot of statistics and research out there on women, and there's a lot of research out there on minorities. There's not a lot out there when you combine the two. So if you're a woman of color, you've got both the issue of being a woman and being a minority, and combined, you're just not getting the attention that you need. Like, you're not getting your voice heard. And this article does a great job of explaining how women of color in law firms feel as though they are completely invisible. People don't talk to them. And when they do, it's completely platonic. They don't get good work. It's very hard to succeed. And it's not because they can't cut it or they don't want to succeed, but it is so difficult and so miserable to feel seen and heard and valued that the retention of women of color is abysmal. And it's something we have to pay attention to. So this is shocking to me, and I think we have to talk about it, and we have to be willing to address this head on. African American associates in law firms, they have been declining every year since 2009. And I am not just talking about retention. This is a pipeline issue, right? The pipeline is there, but law firms have stopped hiring African American associates. I want you to think about that for a second. So minority numbers have actually gone up, but that's because there has been more hiring of Asian minorities. African American minorities, their numbers are going down. That is unconscious bias, maybe even conscious bias. I can't think of a more obvious example of showing how racism still exists, not just in our country, but in our law firms, in our judicial branches. Only 2.5% of all partners in the United States are women of color. So, as you heard, I said there's 18% female equity partners. Only 2.5% are female minorities. And according to NALP, minority women continue to be the most dramatically underrepresented group at the partnership level, a pattern that holds across all firm sizes and most jurisdictions. That is not okay. So, I hope that this information can again just light a fire within us to push for change. And as a white woman, I ask all of my other sisters that are white women to recognize that although we are pushing for change and although our voice matters, we have to give a platform to minority women so their voice matters too. It cannot just be white women sharing their problems. We have to be willing to say, I don't understand your situation and I want to know more about it, and I want to know how I can be an advocate for you. And if you have female minorities in your firm and you're not really speaking with them except for those platonic conversations, that needs to change today. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox, but this is a super, super important issue. We can't just be talking about women. We have to recognize that women of color are really suffering within the legal profession, and it is not acceptable. Okay, how about a little bit of better news? Sorry, I get fired up. I get so passionate about these issues. All right, so we've got a little bit of progress to report in some other areas. Only one area met the challenge, so I'll let you think about which one that is. Okay, so general counsel. 23% of Fortune 500 general counsel positions are now filled by women. So that's progress. We did not hit the 30% mark, but we did improve. So we went from approximately 15% to 23%. That is a good signal. I think that companies, especially the Fortune 500 companies, are taking the issue of gender bias and they're really trying to face it head on. They are doing a very good job of actively seeking out and recruiting and promoting women in those roles. For the Fortune 1000 and in private companies, the numbers aren't as good. So the Fortune 1000, I think it's more like 21%. And once you go to private companies, it gets back down to where we were a decade ago. So I do think that that gives us a glimpse of how we can make change, though. We just have to be committed and we have to say, we're going to fill these roles. We're going to fix the problem. No more excuses. I think with the private companies and with law firms, there are a lot of excuses to go around and they say, we just don't have the right women or good women or lots of other excuses. You just have to do it. You have to face it. And I think the Fortune 500 companies are doing a decent job of trying to accomplish that. Okay, so next is the group that actually hit the 30%, and that's the professors. 37.5% of tenured positions in law schools are now held by women. Yay! We have one where we actually met the challenge. So that's good news. I would love to see that at 50%, but 37.5% is great. Good for the law schools for making progress on that. I get frustrated with law schools a lot, but this is one where I think we should really celebrate their progress in this area because they certainly made the most within the last decade. And then last, I just wanted to share about judges. So overall, if you look at all federal and all state judgeship positions, we now have 27% of women in those roles. So almost at 30%, but not quite. There's some great data out there. You can go to the ABA Commission on Women to get a full rundown from federal, Supreme Court, circuit courts, district courts, and then even state positions. If you're interested in that, go check it out. It's super helpful. And we'll put all of this in the show notes. So we have NALL.org, NALP.org, as well as the ABA Commission on Women. And in fact, I'll provide direct links to the PDFs of the reports if you're interested in reading all of it. So where do we go from here? I mean, all of this information can be a bit depressing. If you're a woman in the legal industry, you probably are like, yeah, I already know this. I go to work every day and feel it and see it and hear other women talking about it and sharing their similar experiences. But I do think it's helpful to validate that you're not alone, that this is a national phenomenon that continues to be a problem. We are now 25 years out of law schools graduating women at a rate of 50%. And yet we're not really making much progress at all, especially in law firms. And it looks like we're plateauing, if not even going a little bit backwards in the last decade. And so it's up to us to really make a change. We cannot get comfortable So what do we do? I mean, if you've not listened to episode number 4, Don't Blame It on the Kids, I highly encourage you to do that. I think that a lot of law firms say that they can't promote women on the basis that they're having children. But there are plenty of other industries out there that have proven otherwise. And as I say in that episode, the fact that minority men aren't doing any better either means that this is not about kids. Now, granted, that is an issue, but that is not the main driver. So in my opinion, I think that the leading issues are unconscious bias, microaggressions and inequities, lack of inclusion, and inflexible and demanding hours. Again, I kind of go through this in episode number 4. Check that out if you haven't heard it. But I think those are the issues we have to be tackling. And I don't think we're doing a good job of doing that right now. And I think it's really up to the women's initiatives and the diversity initiatives to say, you know what, we want to stop doing events. We want to stop just being outward facing so that clients think that we're doing a good job with diversity issues, because we all know it's not true. We actually want to make a difference. We don't just want to be a box that someone is checking. And so here are the issues that we think are the main drivers, the main causes of our inability to retain and promote women in law firms. And we want to do something about it. And so here are our proposals. And whether that is training, whether that is just having town halls, whether it is having conversations or making guaranteed spots on compensation committees or boards, whatever it is, get creative. You are problem solvers. Like, that's your profession. That's what you're great at. So it's time that we say, okay, no more committees where we're just holding events. We're going to start to actually deal with the underlying issues, and we are going to move the needle. And I would encourage you to go to your firm, to go to your company and say, let's do our own challenge. This isn't a NAL challenge. Let's do our own challenge. And let's say what we want the numbers to be in 10 years. Let's look at it every year and let's be committed to it. And let's put those numbers out there every year and talk about the progress. Talk about an uncomfortable conversation, and a lot of law firms won't do it, but why not ask them to? So that would be my call to action for you today, is to pick one thing that you can go back to your firm or your company with to say, let's try to do this differently. And you've got data, you've got stats to back up that progress is not being made. So it's time to try something new. All right, that is it for today. You can get all of the resources at the show notes. It will be at hustleandflowpodcast.com/9. And I look forward to speaking with you next week. Have a great day. For show notes, downloads, and other free resources, and to keep the conversation going, head on over to hustleandflowpodcast.com. See you there.